Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Burns. I'm the Vice President of the Florida Veterans for Common Sense. And we have so many outstanding projects in this community going. The one I like to brag about is our trees. Climate change is a national security issue. We met and decided we're going to try to do something about it in our small way, so we took on planting trees. Most experts will tell you that trees are our best friends, and they are the things that can help us. So our first tree planting was at the celery fields. There's about 300 trees. I'm kind of in charge of that, but everybody here has put in their sweat and blood planting the trees. We've funded, we raised money in the community, and so far we have about 8,000 trees planted in this community. And we have so many more planned. If any of you would like to help, come out, volunteer, dig the holes, plant the trees. I see some very healthy, strong-looking people out there, so you would be welcome.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Taylor. For those of you that don't know me, I am the director for Vets in Focus. We film all of our meetings, and we do projects. I film projects like the microforest for our organization. And I have the task tonight of introducing a friend of mine who is working on a documentary film with me on natural disasters. He is a planner. His credentials are 9 miles long, so I told him he was only going to get a small royal treatment, not the VIP treatment, but here it goes. He grew up in Florida. He's a really humble guy. He's had 30 years of experience in this job as a natural environmentalist, and he knows what he's talking about, and I really want you to pay attention to what he's got to say because you're going to learn a lot. My friend, Eugene Henry. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me here. I'm really honored, and thanks. And how many of you have been up since the sunrise? Yeah, it's a lot of us, right? Yeah, I mean, and it's always beautiful that time of the morning because no one else is usually out, or at least when you're walking the dog. So I was working over in Central Florida. So right now, after retiring from Hillsborough County as a hazard mitigation manager, and I worked there for a great number of years, and I've worked in both public and private, mostly public, and as a planner, but a planner that focuses in on emergency management, hazard mitigation, floodplain management. So I was over in Central Florida working with some folks on floodplain management, and it's because it's so important because everybody's flooding, right? Everybody's been flooding. So remember back when, in the 1950s, I think it was, when all the insurance companies said, hey, we're not going to do flood insurance, and it slowly came about. So that's why, right now, the federal government stepped in with the National Flood Insurance Program back in 1968. Now we have private flood insurance again. But if you look at it, the prices are not as they were. Anyway, I was over in Central Florida helping up, and I zoomed on down here after taking the dog out. We have a beautiful dog. It's a Plott hound mixed with a lab. So if you know a Plott hound, they're very hyper, and they smell out anything. And then the lab is very kind, and they point at everything. So which is really nice because she gets all hyper, jumps all around, finds a rabbit, and then points. So I don't have to be pulled into the woods. So. All right, so what we're going to talk about, and I got my notes up here, and you'll see it coming up behind me. And so this is going to be open a little bit, and I'm very animated when I begin talking. So Dave told me I have this square, so I have to stay in here, but you'll see my hands everywhere. So those that are on Zoom, you won't see my hands, everybody else will. That could be a good thing. All right, so what we're going to talk about is something that you grew up with, and that's natural risk. So our natural risk are just things that happen. So I remember growing up and we had to build our dock. It was on the St. Lucie River. And we had to build our dock that stood like 6 or 7 feet out of the water. Why? Because the tides came in. And then you had storm surges. We had a house on the St. Lucie River that was built in the 60s. And I think my dad paid maybe $13,000 for it. Boy, what a difference. But it flooded maybe twice. Not a whole lot of water, a little bit, it came in, but it was all concrete block, terrazzo floor. So Mom just gave us a bucket, had Clorox, we wiped it up, cleaned it up. The worst thing during a flood during that time is you had to go down and help neighbors, which was fine. We took skimboards out. And that was probably a bad thing because we had septic tanks and you shouldn't be skimboarding in septic tank water. But, no one told us better. But the worst thing about it was you couldn't flush the toilets, right? Because your septic tank would overcome. So that was, but see, we lived with the risk. We knew what we had to do. We knew what came once in a while. We knew what the extremes were, so we lived with it. And as you see here, the most important thing is, at that time, no one told you about your risk. They just occurred. Today, if you look at that top picture, by the way, that's me at a very young, much younger, over 10, 15 years. So anyway, your natural risk, and I'm not going to look up there because I got the camera right here, and Gene on the other Zoom side when I only see half my side. So, and by the way, I shaved a couple of weeks ago. So the natural risks are always there. And then what's the increasing risk is that I studied hazards, natural hazards under geography, and I later became a planner. And then I later went and did my graduate work in public administration. So there's cycles of your risk. They peak and they go up. So you have 10-year movements of cycles. What we have now, and I used to come in with all types of numbers because I'm a planner, right? I'm a quantitative geographer. I just love numbers and I love, working with communities. But I don't have a whole lot of numbers for you tonight, so because you've seen them. They're all on the news, they're in books, they're in newspapers, they're in all types of committees, congressional committees, so on and so forth. But you know that we have this cycle, and it moves through time, and it's just our risk. Things happen, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, it's always there. But we have this peak periods that come by, and so you get a little bit more volume, a little bit more intensity, but then it comes back down and you go down. What's happening is these peaks are moving up. We're getting more severe storms and floods. And I responded to, in 2010, I responded to a drought that caused sinkholes in Hillsborough County, and it was a disaster declaration. I've worked on over 20 different disaster declarations. After retiring for Hillsborough County, I was a FEMA reservist, expert planner for a little bit. But that added to that number. So what you have are these storms that just occur, and you're normally looking at them, so we have this frequency that's increasing. And that just makes us, mop up the floors a little bit more. Or as Ian came through, it does devastating things because the severity's there. And we've built our homes to a code. Now, a lot of those homes that are affected, like my little brother, he was right where in Edgewater where the Hurricane I went through. And it was at 90-mile-per-hour winds. They had over 20 inches of rain. He just had a change in flood insurance rate maps. I told him to keep his flood insurance. It was going to be a great deal. It would drop in price, but he didn't. He says, no, they removed me. Well, it was a sheet flow from the St. Johns River versus the ocean, and he ended up with floodwaters. So, and this because they had 20 inches of rain. And the home wasn't built to be elevated above 20 inches of rain of sheet flow coming through. So you had this peak, this intensity. And so you have these things as the second picture down. So you have the older construction, which you see there, and we do. We remodel, we rebuild, we put our building codes to work. We work with the international code now. Florida Building Code uses that as a framework, and we do things on top of that. And then down there, you do your land development. We're doing land development just really increasingly better. We know where to put things, we know where not to. And sometimes people say, well, I can still do things differently, and they go ahead. As long as they build to the higher standards, you're not taken away from the community. I had a county administrator one time call me in the office, and he says, darn it, Gene, do something about this part of the river. It always floods. And I says, well, we don't get any grants. They don't want anything. He says, no, but they have to take out their refrigerators and their washers and dryers every time it floods. And that costs our community over millions of dollars that they're not paying for, everybody else has to put in for. So those people are out employed and so on and so forth. And then we know exactly where things are going to occur on the catastrophic events. The bottom picture you see there, you can't really see and zoom into it, but that's a community called Ruskin. There'll be over 20,000 people flooded if you have something like Hurricane Ian come through, just in a little fraction area of Hillsborough County. You're talking about over probably 50 to 100,000 structures that would be flooded. So if you go next, if you get bored, just holler. I can always do sit up. So, this is what we do. We live here. So the picture on the far right, that's your that's where we live. I mean, that's a part of our West Coast. Homes. There's over 500,000 buildings in that area right there alone. And all the yellow and the blue and the magenta, those are high risk just alone flooding. It doesn't have the windborne debris area. It doesn't have anything else. It doesn't have the sinkholes, which you'll see later in a moment. But the reason we live, because we're very peaceful, the lighthouse, that's out there on Egmont Key, but there's other ones throughout Florida. That's downtown Tampa. And if you look in the background over there, that's MacDill Air Force Base. MacDill Air Force Base used our construction code, gosh, when they were building the new housing. And they used the local mitigation strategy, that's a fancy word for a hazard mitigation study, to know the risk for their area. So they're ready, they know it's coming, it's just they built to a minimum 1% storm event for the housing. And when they evacuate, I used to work with the EOC when times of disaster. So when they work, they have to schedule everything in advance. So now, if you have further intensification of storms and higher storm surge events that you're expecting, they have to plan further in ahead. Now you got a transportation system. So one of the things I did is I reviewed development review. You're going to put a beautiful, wonderful housing project over there. But did you know it takes over 50 hours to leave that point in a Category 1 storm surge to the other side of the county, just the county, on the other side of Interstate 475. So that's 50 hours that you're on the highway trying to get out of Hillsborough County. So we try to tell people, don't run. Get out of where it's going to flood, but try to stay. You know, get it with a family member, a friend. And we had some folks that try to partner people with so on and so forth. There's all types of issues that come up with that you have to think about as a type of planner that deals with that. But that's what we work with. And your Air Force, your Navy, everybody has to deal with it. Norfolk is working remarkably well, and things you don't think about, things that your community has to work with, but we still go with the smaller, sort of behind the scenes, and we still work with the minimal thresholds and such. But Norfolk is working because the sea level rise is increasing, and they have ground subsidence, not sinkholes, but ground subsidence is that the sea is coming into them much faster. So when they have a king tide or a high tide, it's taking more and more of their property. They've changed their land development code, things you wouldn't think about, saying, well, if you're going to build there and you start flooding so often, we're going to, you just can't, your home's going to become so damaged at some point, you just can't go back to it. And that's part of their regulations now. And anyway, we live here. Yes, we're vulnerable, and there are different types of levels of vulnerabilities. So before I retired, I helped update some codes, both land development code and building codes, but we also created a vulnerability study. I also worked with some consultants to do a chemical contamination study. That means if you have these floods and these storms, these chemicals go everywhere. So you have acute and chronic situations that these chemicals will get into you, and you got to live with the rest of your life. Or you're re-entering into your subdivision, and then you have these situations where you have a long-term effect to your children if you don't take care of it or think about it on your re-entry. So that's the type of vulnerability. And then you also have people, for instance, I worked with a planning group that went down to Rockport. So I took time off down, and that's where Hurricane Harvey hit. Hurricane Harvey drove so many people away from the coastal areas. Rockport's a beautiful little town, and it was dead center for Hurricane Harvey. And it wiped almost everything out. So we were in a planning group. We were helping them with Texas A&M, help rebuild and helping give them the council members and the commission and all that, some foresight. But you know what their biggest problem was? It was the people, the vulnerability, because the people that provided the work, the businesses couldn't reopen. So you have all this devastation. You have these buildings that are smacked down to the ground. You have boats that are pushed up over railroad tracks. I worked Hurricane Katrina. Remarkable what Mother Nature can do. But at the same time, it affects people. So all these people in the coastal areas went up to San Antonio, Dallas. You know what? You take your kids, you put them in school, you did what you could. You had to get another apartment. They couldn't come back because at first the businesses couldn't open full time. They were just coming out, and then they didn't have any housing. So how are you going to get people back? So it's a catch-22. It just run, and that's why you have what we call long-term redevelopment. So that's a long way to get into talking about what we're going to talk about today. So, I have 40 years, over 20 different disaster declarations. I did retire full-time. I am working full-time, though. I'm working for a company that's a contractor with FEMA. we help communities with their community rating system, looking at their flood insurance and working with higher standards, making sure their citizens and such are taken care of. And then I've flown airplanes. I've surfed Hurricane David. So that's a little story. I met the gentleman, actually, that was blowing the whistle at me. He was a police officer, Hollywood, Florida. So we were out there surfing. And they came out, they turned the lights on, they were hollering at us kids to get in from surfing. I don't know why my parents weren't worried. That must have been something about me. But so all of a sudden we realized that we were in deep stuff because the bridges went up over the intercoastal. We stayed out there and surfed, but we realized that, that's a horrible feeling. Everybody just left you. And you're out there, and the waves weren't that good anyway. It was choppy. They were 7-10 feet. It was okay. But, I don't know if it was worth the risk. But anyway, that was, and then I've hiked, and the first time I received leeches was when I was hiking the Everglades. And so in the Everglades, you hike hammock to hammock. So I felt this thing rubbing underneath my shirt, and underneath my shirt were a bunch of leeches. So that was my first time. You pull them off, it's just like the movies. You start trickling blood and everything else, and it was like, wow, that was really bizarre. But you follow the alligator trails from hammock to hammock. They're beautiful. You've never done it. It's Section 3. It's just north of the Everglades. Or you can do outside of the Seminole. So, and then natural hazards, risk, and increasing vulnerabilities. That's what we're going to hit upon. And I'm just going to hit it early because you have so much information, and hopefully it brings up questions. And then moving forward, there's some things that you can do that you probably aren't thinking about, or that you say, well, leave that to other people. You need to become more involved because you got to figure out what you're going to lose. If you want, it's okay. I have friends that say, well, I'm buying this house. I pay $4,000 or $5,000 for flood insurance for 13 or 900 square feet, but I parked my boat there. And that's what I love. I'm going to die after 40 years anyway. So those are decisions that you can make, but you got whole communities that need to make those types of decisions. All right, again, this is where we're at. This is what we love. This is the blue sky. This is what you do, but there have to be people in the back room that have to say, what happens if the stuff hits the fan? How do we recover? How do we deal? How do we work our commerce? Did you know if Tampa Bay goes down, all the gas in Central Florida, you guys probably know this, a lot of audiences don't, but you don't have any fuel. For most of you got some that comes in through Titusville and stuff, but that's about it. You got some that can be trucked up from South Florida, but you're going to have problems because if something hit that hard, it went across the state of Florida. So those are things that you have to think about as a movement of commerce. Did you know that if parts of Interstate 4 go under between the Port Tampa and the airport, you stop the movement of commerce altogether? There's I forget how many millions of dollars a minute just stops. And that puts people out of business. And those are things you got to think about. Are you going to let those businesses rebuild or put somebody else back into that business? So when at the very beginning, I started talking about the storms and all that, and there's cycles and there's intensities that are occurring. Well, that's part of the climate change. If you step back 10,000 years, you could drive further west off the coast of Florida. So we've had climate change quite a while. What we have now is a change in climate change that's picking up that our standards for buildings, our social environments and networks, our commerce can't keep up with all those changes. And we can get more, if you have questions later, we can get more specifics. But one example is like that transportation. If you shut transportation down, how many businesses did you just knock out? Take COVID, for example. So that's one thing. All right, so now we're going to get into the juice and stuff, and I've worked a lot of these. And that far one on the bottom left, this is just a minimal flood event in downtown Tampa. When I mean minimal, it's not exactly a 1% storm event, but it's close to it, but it's a tropical storm. So, you break the seawall, it's neat, people go out there canoeing and stuff. On the other side of downtown Tampa, and of course you're having the same thing happen over there on the coast part of MacDill, so those folks are already gone. They've already flown the aircraft out and so on and so forth, depending on the size of the storm. But that's it. On the other side, there's a place called McKay Bay. So they dredge McKay Bay a little bit, and this is where things come in because you have to keep building up, right? At least until you get to a point and say, well, I can't build up and fortify anymore, so now I got to retreat. Where are you going to retreat? We'll talk a little bit about that and just give you a little clue a little bit later. But on the other side, so they dredged up some of McKay Bay. You know what was on the bottom of McKay Bay because it drained all the agricultural areas? DDT. Guess what? They put that up on the port. So the workers out there, I don't know if I should be saying this. Anyway, because I reviewed those reports and I had reported on for the floodplain management program for the NFAP. But they put it up there, part of the report is they put it up there, so they're compacting all that down. That's where they're going to build the next building or facility. So do people wear masks? Do they have gloves? All right, so those are things that when you're talking about climate change, it's more than just sea level rise. I remember when it first came up, I got to Hillsborough County about 20-something years ago, and I was all gung-ho about, you see the ground collapse over there? Sinkholes. I had over 300 sinkholes in 2010. 300 homes. All right, simple. You could have easily called that area suspect soils under the building code. Do they do it? I tried to pull up a map in 1999 to 2000 to be able to show the residents. I was told, allow for that network or that connection so people can go look at it, but don't put it up on the website. The reason being because it quote unquote frightens people. They won't build. But you know what? If I told you your house was going to collapse, but if you put micropiles because the soil is karst, and those micropiles would hold your foundation up, and then you could put grout in underneath without the cracking and crumbling of your foundation, you were to say, well, how much is it going to cost? Well, if you're building your house, maybe $2,000-$3,000 more. Wouldn't you say, heck yeah, I would do something like that? Yeah. I mean, it just makes common sense. But we're so afraid of hurting our industries sometimes that we forget to ask industry and say, well, here's the resolution, here's what we can do. Can you work with it? They would say yes. So those are things. Wildfires, I got another picture over there of Sun City Center, and it was, I think it was just before President Bush flew in. Anyway, and there's a story because I had to change all land development codes because of that fire, and there's a reason why. But that's what goes into climate change when you're like me and you love numbers and you love to write things. But you got wind. This is an older home. It didn't take much to peel that back. Really, so this is, so the trusses looked like they almost held together, but they weren't really hurricane clipped. This is an older home. So now we know why we have hurricane clips, and we know why we elevate homes. And Florida is very expensive to live in when you got a lot of risk, but it's not so bad if you catch the homes at the beginning. And retrofitting, when you're doing a re-roof, they could come in there and put the clips in, and they can put different things on that roof. Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, great people. They started out in Florida, by the way. I used them in the early 2000s to get out to my neighborhoods. Institute for Business and Home Safety. They have a wonderful wind tunnel and everything else. They used to work over at Mosey, for those that remember, in the Museum of Science and Industry. Anyway, so these are some of the things that we work with. Now you got wildfire. So there's that center picture. So that's Sun City Center. So what happened, this is about the period that President Bush was flying in and talked to 3,000 community folks. And so what happened is fires, so the Florida Fire Code requires that subdivisions have 2 exits and 2 entrances. So guess what? It can be on the same major arterial. So this emptied out on US 301. But they had a wildfire coming through. So school let out, kids are at the home, parents are trying to rush home to get their kids because news is flashing the wildfires. It jammed zero movement and traffic on those roadways. They had to come in and put those fires out with brush trucks in some of the areas. So that said, so I was pulled in, so you get the after action reports back when they used to do them, and you have these, they still do them. It's just, they were a little bit more crude in the earlier days. And then you have a hot wash where people are just straight up, right? They're saying, what the heck, excuse me. And why did that happen? Well, you jammed up the road. You had too much traffic. And then, so what we did is we changed the code. You can have 2 entrances. So what we did is, even though you're not going to go out on an arterial, you can literally go in through a conservation area, but you have to have an entrance that can handle 13 tons. Again, that's a part of the life that you work with. Fires are a part of Florida. I worked out in Wyoming as their chief resilience officer for a little bit. I was helping them, and I helped them with their mitigation program and such. And I've seen the fires out there, and I've seen the fires in Florida. I've seen wildfires leap over 4 lanes with a median filled with pine trees all the way over Interstate 95 and reach and grab the other side. In fact, I was getting ready to help my brother evacuate. I drove across Florida to help him, talk to folks in Palm Coast. It gets so hot it melts things. The ones out west are just it gets so hot, it crystallizes or hardens the soil, and it kills everything. So when you start the rains, then you have a flood. So, you say, well, the two don't go together. Yes, they do. So if you have a horrible fire and then you have a rainfall, you just flooded a community downstream. Those are things, and if you keep having those wildfires like we've had, and I did some numbers, and I got a notebook over there. I have some before I leave. I'll read them out. And I just took decennial periods and looked at them. But they've been increasing. The numbers of disasters that we declare have been increasing. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. And you could do if you remember your old Fortran days, you could do a three-dimensional array. There's so much data. But the thing is that we also measure disasters different. We lose more money because we put a lot more expensive things in the way of risk, hazards, and then so that becomes vulnerable. And the people that we put there, depending where they are, they become very vulnerable. And a lot of times people just along a lot of our Florida coast, they're underinsured. So they become vulnerable because it's like my little brother, he didn't have flood insurance. So the other brothers that are remaining all came together and we all helped. It became a family affair. So, but anyway, Florida fires become so hot because of the palmettos. But I've seen fires out west become so hot, and I had a geologist, take me out to see it. It marbleized the surface of the soil. And it was just remarkable what Mother Nature can do. Now, if you put a house out there and you don't practice fire-wise, like what was the name of the one out in California? I'm not going to mention names. But but we have a disaster declaration for it. They didn't practice fire-wise. It was beautiful, beautiful wooden cabins under beautiful, old pines. And guess what? They didn't have any clearance around a lot of those homes. So, when the fire came through. This is the map they wouldn't let me show. They said, you can point people to it. And this was back in 1999 and 2000. So the people there probably wouldn't even let me show this. But so the red zone, so I live in the red zone, not the pink zone. Yeah, that's where I live. Isn't that terrible? And I lived in an area, and I says, no, and all right, so in Florida, and this is another thing, you can have parametric insurance, you can have riders. I do, because I work with this industry, I have flood insurance. I'm 3 feet above the base flood elevation inland, but I'm in a closed basin. An old timer said, Gene, you're going to flood because in and I remember the flood too. Remember Interstate 4 flooding? It went over the railroad tracks where I live, and they says, well, your house is below those railroad tracks, so you're going to flood. So I carry flood insurance. But I said, I'm in an area that has lower risk than other areas because it was also along a place called Hooker Lake. Guess what? There was a sinkhole down the street to my neighbors. They're no longer there. There's new neighbors in there because contractors can get licenses to fix things and or permits. So they took, how many cement trucks it took to fill in that sinkhole? 13 of those big trucks. My daughter and I watched it. She says, Dad, is that sinkhole under us? And I says, hopefully they're filling it up. So, hopefully I'm okay. But the point is, when you have drought periods in the state of Florida and other periods, you start to remove the weight or the support capacity of that soil. One thing is, and a bunch of scientists are probably listening, they're saying, Gene's so far out in left field, that's a superficial way of saying it. But you got this period where you'll start to collapse. Then you start the rainy season again. Then back at that other picture with that catastrophic collapse on that apartment complex in Orlando, then you start having those because you start to have the rain, things start to fill in those gaps, and things crash in. We have the information. We have the information of the frequencies and changes. We have the information of what it takes to build in those areas as well. So flooding and natural gas, that bottom left is the state of Florida's largest above ground reservoir. We worked in the zoning. We ensured still people are going to flood. So that has if you evaluate it and the potential breaks and everything else, there's 3,000 people at risk here. So they had sirens. They do still have them at this one. Sirens don't really work because people just look up in the air and say, oh, what's coming? And it only takes a few inches of water to knock you off your feet. And then you're going down to the drain, and then if you hit the little swell, you're going to be pushed on down to the Wildfire River. You go there, the alligators will find you in a couple of days. So anyway, flooding is one of our greatest risks. Flooding's always occurred. Florida has always flooded. In what year was it? El Nino, the big, large El Nino that we had. I have pictures of my community that was all water. They did a flyover, and it's all glistening. You know, it looks like a shine. That's because there's water everywhere. And it was almost all the way down the entire half of the state. So we live with that. But we've said, you know, you got to build up a little bit. Now we have structures that are built with a life expectancy of no less than 30 to 50 years. My wife and I just helped our youngest, because I'm a granddad, just turned a granddad a couple of weeks ago. So the last full moon. So, but what happens, you know how old her house is? It was built in 1910, downtown Plant City. So, yeah, I know. It's actually nicer than mine. So, and she has room enough because we just got an RV too, so we can park our RV on the outside and sell our house. And so I don't have to worry about sinkholes, floods, and wind and all that, and insurance. So, but the average house, what they don't tell you, is going over 100 years. So do the math. It's simple. If you are trying to keep up with the wind strength and the severity or the flood elevations, and you built your house in 1910, you're not keeping up, right? You can't, there's some things you can do. You can put clips on there, you can do better windows. If you're gonna have a higher frequency of sinkholes, you know, you can go in there. She's on piers, so that's really good because we can shoot grout up underneath without her cracking the elevation and such. But there's some things, like I said, her house is better than mine, built in 1910. So, but there's things that you can do, but like my house, say that we keep increasing the wind speeds and the frequency of Category 5 storm, you know, hurricanes or storm surge or the rainfall events, because I'm in a closed basin. So the flooding can end up getting my house eventually. So I can't go automatically and blink my eyes. If those who watched I Dream of Jeannie back in the 60s, you can't blink your eyes and make those standards change. So now you have to start thinking far in advance. You have to say, we are in this time of change, an expedited change. Like I said, you go back 10,000 years, you could drive off the coast of Florida. The climate here and the vegetation was different. But we're not working over 10,000 years here. We're working over a short period of time where things are changing. Our construction standards have to keep up, and you got to make your decision. Are you going to do the minimal? You know, what the code says, that's what we call minimum. And, or are you going to do a little bit more? Are you going to be able to go in there and look at those numbers and say, okay, that's what I need to build to. I need to put these types of clips on. I need to do, you know, reinforced concrete into our cement, which we do anyway. So I put this one in there because Port Tampa has a huge, you know, natural gas thing. And, but also we work with natural gas. We work with petroleum. Tampa Bay works with a huge amount of petroleum. And we do pipelines, and we also work with anhydrous ammonia. We've had some of those leaks. I'd had a good buddy of mine. He used to work on my team before I retired. Now he's out in the private sector. His uncle lived out there and right off of Tampa Bay, right there in downtown. So they had the sirens go off one night. So him and his neighbors ran outside, and they were trying to hear what the siren says. It says shelter in place. It's because they had a leak of anhydrous ammonia and there was a cloud coming across, but it dissipated, thank goodness. There was all these types of things, but the increase in storms, the rainfall, you know, just everything that goes along with it increases the vulnerabilities of those facilities as well. That chemical contamination study I did, or had actually worked with ESA, if anybody knows those consultants, and it's a one of a kind. The types of chemicals that can be spilled during a storm or a disaster, you live with. You don't walk away and just brush your feet off. I responded to one early on in the career. I responded to one urban flood. I was helping people get out of a flooded apartment complex, and it was Station 1. Fire chief comes up and says, "Where are you going?" I says, "Well, I'm heading home." He says, "Like hell?" He says, "You need to go down to Station 1, and we got to decon you." And that's the first time I heard about it in training and stuff, but they said, "No, you got to go down. You got all types of stuff on you, and you aren't going anywhere close. And by the way, we might want to just throw your car away." And but we saved a lot of people. So anyway, that's just a little one I throw in there because that's something else you have to work with. Exercising is really important. I know I've been to the Navy Yard in DC, if I said that correctly. Yeah, okay. And I've been there twice on different exercises. And so when you're on me, even I've been on the private side, if we aren't looking for the community, and that's what we do, we spent our careers doing that. So if you aren't looking out for those that don't know better and giving them the tools to do it, then we haven't really done our job. So I don't know how well I've done over the last 40 years, but I think I did pretty good. So this is a toolbox. I can see some of you getting bored. So this is a toolbox. This is what you have to take into consideration when you're making a policy decision. Now, you know where that goes. It goes into, and I can say this because I'm no longer working for really anybody that, is I'm not tied to them politically or anything of that sort. So this is what happens when you, as staff, look at things and you're looking at all those. I knew I was working on climate change and climate adaptation over 20 years ago. I was working with University of Colorado and their information. I was working with Dr. Doyle out of Florida State University, just so many. And we were putting this stuff into where people would just pull out the drawer and start using it because it would become second nature to what they do and what they live in, how they go about living. But we have short-term vision. Sometimes politics makes short-term visions. So when that happens, you don't always get all of this toolbox. And those people looking at me, I was looking at the board. So you don't get all this information that's in the toolbox into your hands. And that's, I'm going to leave it at that because I could really bore you and get into each one of those. I've spent days training this stuff too. This is really called post-disaster redevelopment, but we'll leave it at that. And I'm not going to bore you with this either, but you had to see it. A lot of numbers go in there. A lot of your land use planners, they know the consequences, they know the probabilities, they know the return cycles. What we aren't so sure about, and we're getting a better feel for it, is the severity. So you look down here and a major hurricane, moderate for this community. It's a major consequence. That means you're so I did an econometric model for a community once and ran a bunch of other numbers to bring it down to the census designated, little places, economic places in the community. So because econometric model is done at a larger scale, so we zoomed it into a smaller area where people live, right? And and the model said 7 to 10 years for them to rebuild, and longer than that if you don't start now. Doing things in advance, letting people know. If you go back to that first picture where you saw me standing up 15, 20 years ago in front of a crowd, then if you don't do that and get out and talk to people, then what you're really going to work with is a recovery period of over 15 years in lots of cases. A good example is look at southern Louisiana. I think they've had 30 disasters in the last 15, 17 years. Isn't that remarkable? How can you, all right, I have friends that live there, but I don't know how they live there. How can you live with 30 different federal declared disasters in 15 years or 17? It's just crazy. But see, and then we got the frequency on the major one, 50 years. It's no longer 50 years. So those things are changing. That's why you have to keep updating. That's why your information's coming in. The frequencies are changing, but guess what? I just built a critical facility over there. It's supposed to stay at least 50 years, if not long, and it's going to stay longer. You know it is. So how do you work with that? So now you have to look at fortification. So climate adaptation has so many things, but if you don't do it, you don't look at it, and you don't look into the future, then that happens. I will give you a little thing. My dad didn't really care. I love the flood insurance program because it helps so many people. But my dad really sort of looked at me cross-eyed. He was a World War II vet. And he says, why? Why are you telling people about this program when you're giving them, when then they can't return? They don't have enough in the bank to rebuild. You know something's going to happen. They're going to flood. And they're not, just like my little brother did. Family chipped in. They aren't going to have enough to put themselves back to normalcy. So this is another thing. I'm not going to bore you with this either. But we know there's serious consequences. We've just saw it. Hurricane Michael. I worked Hurricane Katrina. I worked so many different hurricanes. I was on loan to a community work Hurricane Charlie as a planner for recovery. But and this planning was my hobby. All right, so that's why I went out to Wyoming. Of course, Wyoming's really great. It's a beautiful place. If you haven't been there, I really strongly say the people are really, really nice. They just don't allow you to say climate change. So it's okay. But they've got beautiful property, and they have lots of wildfires, and they have lots of floods. But really great. It is beautiful. I had wonderful times. And they work at a pace that is a lot different than I'm supposed to be part-time retired. But I remember taking off on Fridays, and I'd just go out into the red desert, highest desert, I think, in the northern hemisphere, and they have a herd of elk. Anyway, I get sidetracked. I do that. Fall into a rabbit hole. So anyway, the consequences of not planning for your risk. Your vulnerabilities are there. I just told you about them. A risk, a hazard is not, there's no risk with it, just a hazard. If you have something that comes in over a salt flat, okay, crabs got in some birds and wading birds and such, yeah, they were hurt. But our built environment, if we put that, and Sarasota is really good at this, by the way, they put a lot of property in open space that is that has hazards that are open to hazards, very risky, and can be very vulnerable if you build on it. So Sarasota has really done a great job in looking at their flooding and trying to protect their population, saying, well, that also serves natural beneficial functions. You know, you talked about trees, mangroves, they break down, they slow down things in a natural environment. So, and they work very well helping built environments last. But you got to look at the built environment with the natural environment and say, okay, can that help me? Should I do something different? I'll digress for 1 second. So we had some professors from University of Kyoto, I believe it was, come and stay in Hillsborough County. They were looking at our plans. Long story short, they said, Gene, people, you hear about your plans, they do really good, but then they forget about them. You don't do anything to help them remember. So, so we learned that. But they were going to take me out there. So we waited, some folks and I wrote an international paper done, just blah, blah, blah. But it got noticed, and we were going to go out there and give a talk. Of course, COVID hit. I already bought the airline tickets. I didn't get my money back, so that's a whole different story. But what was so neat is he came here, and he studied not only the United States, but he also studied Malaysia and such as well. So there's two communities that I was looking at his analyses, and there's two communities right beside each other. It was a dike. So the one on one side of the dike, they did wonderful. They kept their agriculture where it flooded each year, and they lived with it. They lived in stilted homes, believe it or not. So, and they had canoes that are tied there on the ground most of the year. So on the other side, guess what? They built their homes down on the ground because they were safe by that dike. And this is out in Asia. So, and when the flood broke through the dike, guess what? Their commerce was smashed. Their crops didn't come back because they weren't used to the flood, and they planted something that not with the normal cycle of the environment of that time where they're at. So, the case in point, literally separated by a dike, and you can see perfect example, what happens when you don't live with nature and know what it does and understand your vulnerabilities so you build to them, and those that you don't. And he said something very interesting to me. The folks in Japan, they donate a lot of their time to communities that were, unfortunately, the empire took over during World War II. And the Japanese people go down and help the communities down there. And that he was studying that to say, okay, why is this community so badly hit during the economic time, after a disaster? And this one's not, and it's right next door. So they, numbers help show things. Oh, and I forgot to tell you next one. But that's the lifeline, stabilization. You got to think of that stuff. And, that's where I was talking about serious consequences if you don't bring that stuff into play. And you need people like me, sort of eggheads, because, I'm the type of person by 7th grade that I was reading Socrates because I didn't understand it. Why is everybody saying, but, he was remarkable. If you look at the math that they did, they were doing math that I was saying, wow, that was my professor or my teacher at 7th grade can't even do that stuff. And then I used to go down so I used to have a motorcycle. I rebuilt it. My parents weren't home. I'd take it down to Pompano Beach. And because then by that time we moved down to South Florida. So I'd go down into the basement of Florida Atlantic University, and I'd dig through the abstracts. Things are hidden. They don't want people to really normally read. And I learned about cloud seeding in the state of Florida with silver iodide in the early 1960s. Silver iodide's not really good for you. They didn't tell anybody. But, and it didn't really, they couldn't get it to scientific, they couldn't show statistically that it worked well enough in the state of Florida. So how do you start working with all this? So you have sustainable areas and you have vulnerable areas. You have areas that are sustainable and vulnerable that you're going to rebuild. MacDill Air Force Base is right there at the bottom of what you see, if you look at it, that thumb that's sticking out there at the bottom. That's MacDill. That's a vulnerable priority redevelopment area. Now, when I was there, we did some case studies. This really works. There's University of Washington is teaching their graduate students this, and there's a couple others. It's truly our planning commission. We were sitting there trying to devise, okay, if the stuff hits the fan, what are we going to do? Do we know where we want to go, and how are we going to rebuild those areas that are terribly hit? So by doing this, you recognize what's the vulnerable areas, and you recognize those areas that are sustainable. And that just means, okay, if I have a sustainable area, guess what? I'm going to put a lot of stuff there to get that recovered fast, and I'm actually going to make it so it can actually have higher density intensities, because I want people to live there. I want people to work there. I want commerce to actually be able to temporarily even go there from more of the vulnerable areas that they're hitting, because we don't want them to go to Jacksonville. We're selfish that way in Tampa. And we don't want them to go to Orlando. We want them to stay there with us. So you have these sustainable areas, and then once you get people and the energy going within those sustainable areas, because you got services, then you start pushing those services into those vulnerable areas. And that's all that is. Just a nice picture. So, but if you make it work in planning, it really works, by the way. So I always like to give takeaways. If you're really interested, I think they're going to put this on the web. You know, there's forms of natural hazards planning that, you know, you call it whatever you want. It's just planning. You know, my dad told me about zoning in Knoxville in the early 60s. If you wanted something changed, you paid the mayor $10,000. It was legal then, right? The laws have changed, so you can't do that anymore, by the way. And my grandmother's house is part of the University of Tennessee's campus, by the way. I don't know, that doesn't mean anything. It's just neat to see. It's an old house. And then, but you got land use, zoning, you know, you got construction standards, working with industry, very important. And retrofitting structures where you can, helping people retrofit. There is so much money post-disaster that there's no reason for homes to be the way they are and go back. Even if they want to keep them similar, there's really so much money that goes around. And, but looking at the next side, mitigation, resilience, infrastructure, study, drainage, living shorelines, structure mitigation, you know, wind mitigation, working with industry. And industry can do so much. And I could sit here and talk to you all night. I used to teach a little bit back in the 90s over at the Tampa or the Hillsborough County Economic Development Council. Businesses coming into play, you know, build, because my wife and I started our own business, and we said, hey, no one's telling us this, and I knew about all these risks. And so I taught there a little bit, and it was really remarkable because businesses will do the right thing. You tell them what they need to do, or they're going to lose their profit, because most businesses don't have enough to exist for 5 to 7 years as you try to recover. You know, you can try to turnkey, try to change what you're doing if you can. We try to instill that when I was there as well. So anyway, so I highlighted what's really important. The reason is our future. I got a grandchild now. I'm a grandparent. That's a whole new thing, by the way. I don't know, you know, you all are already there. It's old hat for you. But I'm in my mid-60s, and I still got at least another good 25 years. Hopefully I'll outlive my brother. That'd be horrible. I shouldn't say that. They should outlive me. And anyway, you want to be good stewards as well. I mean, that's just what we do as humans, because we have the ability to manipulate things. I was out walking a dried up swamp. You know, there was a 7-foot alligator I tried to keep the dog away from. But the birds and such that nest in those wetlands and such, because that's what it's our dry season, and when it starts to flood, they're gone, and their young ones are gone. So that's what we try to do. You live with the risk. Don't try to create something where you're pretending that it's not there. Don't pretend that we don't have significant hurricanes that can blow away a home and shut you down for 2 weeks. You know what because I worked for the Office of Homeland Security in Wyoming, is under the governor's office. You know what they tell folks? It's not 3 days. If you have something out there, and by the way, the winds are crazy. We had 3 days of hurricane-strong winds. They had to stop the trains and everything. 18 semis were blown over. They say be prepared to be on your own for no less than 10 days. And that's you know. So there's a reality to it. We live in a very urbanized area all over Florida. A lot of people are impacted. A lot of people don't know that. So try to get the word out, try to help folks. Plan and consensus, blah, you know, a bunch of other stuff is blah, blah, blah. But the last yellow highlighted area, know what you're going to lose. Don't, you know, if you do nothing, like when I was growing up, my dad said, well, you know, your actions are more than your words. So what are you going to do? What are you going to lose? Know it. If you're not going to do anything, or if we have some coastal communities, because we have some coastal communities that are beautiful, but they're not going to really fortify. They can't. They're already being impacted by increased storms and such, and you will lose it, and then what you won't regain. And if you're okay with that, if you're not, then you got some things to do while we're still here, and then our children and then their children. You can mitigate, and you can rebuild, fortify, and then eventually you have to run away from something. So, anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Gene, for
Oh.
an excellent presentation.
Well, thanks.
I want to say that right off the bat. And it's Q&A time, folks. Anybody got questions? I got one here in the audience. Mike, would you mind coming up and asking? Right here. We'd like to get you on camera.
We had to race through that, but that was excellent. No, I saw one of your charts, the sinkhole chart.
Yeah.
You get copies of things like that?
Yes. Yeah, that's actually, if you go on the Southwest Water Management District, Southwest Florida Water Management District actually has that there. But if you get Dave to send me an email, I'll get that to you.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You need a broad lens now. You got to switch lenses. It's like camera B. All right. Good question. Sinkholes are scary.
Rich, do we have any from the audience on the Zoom?
We do, Dave. We have one from Jack Merriam, and he'd like to know what's the state doing to address these risks that you've highlighted.
All right, that's super. State of Florida. So when I was with the state of Wyoming, I was on a committee under the, excuse me, with the Governors Association, National Governors Association, as their chief resilience officer, just for a little while. And what they were doing is going to all these states that are doing things. The state of Florida, and it started back, and it's from the Department of Environmental Protection. There are some remarkable staff persons that were there that helped, took an idea that flourished. They pushed it, they took it through, and our legislature actually put things into place, and Florida statutes as well. There's a Peril of Flood Act that coastal communities have to say, what are they going to do? Pretty much what we went over here. What are your risks? Know what your risks are, and what are you going to do about it? And that's very superficial. Look up Peril of Flood Act on the on the web. Google it, and you will find an amazing amount of work. Department of Environmental Protection is putting out infrastructure grants as well as planning grants so communities, both inland and coastal, can figure out how to work with their infrastructure, and I mean significant money. And this is not federal money from disasters. This is the state of Florida. And they're taking in heed about these areas with the that are flooding during the king tides, whatever you call them. But anyway, Florida is way ahead of so many. Now, are they imposing these standards that I would like to see? No, because they're leaving it to the communities, and they're saying listen, you should build up 4 feet over there. Your community just told you that. But the state's saying, here's the money, here's what you do. So it's not an unfunded mandate. It's a funded mandate under the Peril of Flood Act, so to speak. People would argue with me on that. But they're doing enough to give you money to get you going as a community to do the right things and work with your community. Now, here's the drawback to that, because I have a retired attorney buddy, and I hear a lot of you are here, attorneys here. So if I tell you that so I have a community too I'm working with, and they know an area that in 30 years, that whole neighborhood will be underwater during high tides. So he's trying to ensure that when people rebuild, or if they demolish and build something new, that they build to a higher standard above that high tide by at least 1 foot, if not more. And he has to change the codes. He's got to take that to his council and everything else. So he has the analysis that does that. So does the council, so does that jurisdiction. So if I moved into that subdivision, you decide not to do anything. This is what my buddy helped communities with throughout the nation, helped them understand what they could do. And you flooded and lost everything, and you didn't do anything, but you had all that in there right on your office wall or in the book, and you knew about it, but you just didn't want to make the code because it wasn't a good time, so to speak, quote unquote. Then guess what? There's class action suits that are coming about all over the country. You don't hear a whole lot about them, but they're coming about to actually bring communities to the table saying, you knew, you didn't do anything, this is what happened, these are the consequences of you not telling me. So that's going on now, and it's going to happen more and more. A lot of communities are looking at parametric insurance as well. That's where you can take a group insurance for your community, and it's not based on like if I lose that building, I can have that insurance to rebuild that building. You can take that money and help your, for instance, you're working, if you have a lot of workers in a particular neighborhood, happen to be an older neighborhood, and they needed help rebuilding, you can take that's a very superficial, summary way, look at it again, there's enough attorneys in here. So look at that parametric insurance for communities, and that's a way that you can help those vulnerable communities within your overall community reestablish some level or path to normalcy. So, good question.
I believe, Gene, we have one more.
Yes. Gene Jones asked, what's the rate of sea level rise, and is it increasing?
So I purposely did not look up the numbers. Tampa Bay has a scientific committee, and that, as I just mentioned, there is a community that's looking at that, and they did a vulnerability study that's looking at it. So I'm not eluding your question. I just didn't look at the numbers and put them to memory because it's different. I went to a session from FIT about 10 years ago, and you can go down to the microscopic level because, in certain areas where the glaciers went, receded, the granite's, rising because the pressure's off of it. Then you have the glacier melts. Then if you look at the science, it shows that the Gulf Stream didn't change as much as we were anticipating as of yet, but the currents going around Antarctica are. And there's just, our planet is remarkable. So I don't have a clear answer for you. It's all on the web, and you can go to multiple universities. NOAA is the best place to go to. You'll see a lot of different studies on there, and you can look at, and they have models to show you how much you're impacted from a particular community. University of Nevada, in collaboration with the University of Wyoming and I think the University of Colorado, they did a study on the ice packs in the Rockies and other. They got the Bow Mountains, they got the White Mountain. I'm forgetting all my mountains out there because it's been a while, it's been a year. So, but anyways, just beautiful. And they got all these mountains, but the ice pack has gone up. Although they say, Gene, it came all back this year, but it melted fast. But it's changed so much. There's some change from their study, from those three universities, collaboration. There's a change in vegetation, which is affecting the wildlife, wild horses and everything else, grazing areas. But they still have lots of water because they're at the headwaters, so they can shut off the Colorado and keep it all themselves if they wanted. That's an oversimplification. But I'm glad you don't give my email out. So, but anyway, to answer your question, it's all out there. There are so many numbers, so many places. Look at NOAA because they have some excellent numbers. And when I say so many numbers, it's not really that many. There are some good ranges, and that's what we're looking at now, are ranges to work with because you have a built environment. You're looking at our newer standards. How much do we increase them by, for what type of building, where? So there's all of that type of stuff. And if you're going to do what Norfolk did and change your zoning, then you do need to really look at that rate for your area and the loss of property because you're actually literally going to end up, it's not taking the property, but the property is going to disappear and you're going to keep someone from putting fill back in there after a certain point. So sorry I didn't answer your question 100%, but it's all out there in NOAA.
All right, any more questions? How about a round of applause?
Thank you. And it goes to you. Thank you very much.